Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this video, I thought that we could talk about what it means to respect our elders. Because on the one hand, there's a commandment, namely, honor your father and your mother, and that demands of us a certain obedience. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of folks in the 21st century look at their elders with a kind of suspicion or a kind of distrust, and as a result of which, it seems more complicated now to follow out that command than it may have seemed in former times. So, I think it's a question that's worth addressing. It's a question that came up in the comment section of a past video. So let's go ahead and get after it. So I thought that we could just talk about the pertinent virtue which concerns a deference or an obedience shown to elders. And then we could talk about other virtues which help orient us in our efforts to do so well and not like ingenuously or dopily, okay? So the pertinent virtue is piety. Piety is not so much a species of, but it's like a limited expression of justice. Now, you recall that justice is that upright will to give to another what is his due. So in justice, you have a kind of relationship, and in the relationship, there's a recognition of a certain equality, and then you try to render what is due to the other with a precision or with a carefulness because it matters. That's the basic idea. Now, if there are other virtues which kind of are entailed by relationships that we have with other human beings, but they don't have the fullness of justice, right? Maybe it's not possible to be in a relationship in the same way, or it's not possible to establish equality in the same way. Then we ally those virtues with justice, but we say that they're just quasi-potential parts of justice. They're not justice in the full sense. Examples of virtues like this would be like religion, which is the way that we render our lives back to God as a debt of justice, or obedience, whereby we render our lives, we render a certain thing to a superior on account of the fact that the superior is placed over us, or ... There are other examples. But the pertinent virtue here, which concerns respecting our elders, is piety, okay? Which is a strange thing, but you can think about it against the backdrop of the way that piety was extolled in the Roman Empire, pietas, all right? So it concerns specifically one's country and one's parents, and we can extend the logic of it and maybe bring in a little bit of that other virtue that I mentioned, which is sometimes called observance, sometimes called obedience, okay? So in this setting, what we're talking about is a recognition that we have received our lives from country and parents, and that as a result of which, we owe a certain debt of gratitude back to country and to parents. So we're able to live and we're able to enjoy a modicum of liberty on account of the fact that others have chosen for us, all right? They have chosen on our behalf, but they have also made a concrete choice that, brought us into the world. So when it comes to piety, it's not so much a matter of like, I like you or I think you're great. It's just a matter of recognizing the fact that we've come from others, right? That we stand on the shoulders of giants, or that we participate in a democracy of the dead, right? That we're part of a tradition, and that we can't just deny that tradition, or we can't throw that tradition away, or we risk being a kind of crazed revolutionary. G.K. Chesterton says, if you come to a fence in the woods, you ought to know first what it's keeping in or what it's keeping out before you go ahead and tear it down. So we come into the world as the fruit of relationships, and we need to have an appreciation for those relationships if we're going to live well in the context of those relationships. So if we find ourselves constantly criticizing or denying or negating, then we live a terrible solitary existence. And while it may seem to us like we are right, chances are we're more often than not wrong and silly because we've cut ourselves off from the different sources of truth that would ordinarily be our, prized possession if we could just, enter into those relationships. So when it comes to respecting our elders, there's just this baseline affirmation that I have received my life and I render my life back, and I am born within the setting of relationships. So this whole idea that this kind of enlightenment idea that all relationships are constituted by human choice, it's nonsense. We're born into relationships, and we need to accept that fact if we're going to live, profitably and peaceably, and if we're going to, grow in grace and virtue. So when it comes to respecting our elders, I think there's just this basic affirmation that there are others who have gone before us. They've lived lives, maybe better or worse than we might hope, but we can profit from them, from their experience, from their choices, which we are a fruit of, okay? So that's just the baseline thing. Now, all right, that's the thesis here, antithesis. We also recognize, though, that our elders are flawed. And this is a key moment in our lives when we realize, like, our parents, for instance, aren't perfect. They're not gods, right? They are human beings like us in a certain way. And once we come to appreciate that they have flaws, then the next question is, well, what do you do with that? And I think here, in the 21st century, you hear many ways of acknowledging the flaws of generations that have gone before us. I think of maybe one of the most compact ways is just the words, okay, boomer, which is summation and dismissal all in one breath. So there's a sense in the 21st century, especially amongst members of a certain generation, you can think here like millennials and Gen Z, that older generations are like, they're silly, right? They're consumeristic, they're unironic, they watch the news and believe everything that's said, although that phenomenon is going out the window across generations at this point. And then when it comes to Catholic circles, a lot of younger folks are dismissive of those who just like the social aspect or kind of indulge in what we hear described as therapeutic deism, and they have terrible sensibilities when it comes to church architecture or church music or whatever it might be. So among younger Catholics or younger Christians, you can see a certain tendency to kind of, set aside the experience of those who are older. Might be wiser, hard to say, right? Because of these characterizations. So what we see here oftentimes is like pride, scorn, and dismissiveness. Now, might it be merited at a certain level? Yeah, I'm not denying that. But I think that the dispositions of the heart, which younger generations have cultivated, can actually set us up for failure. So I want to address each of these dispositions and kind of confront them with a contrary virtue. All right? So I've said we're going to talk about pride, scorn, and dismissiveness. Well, we're going to address pride with humility. We're going to address scorn with generosity of spirit. And we're going to address dismissiveness with docility. All right, so here we go. So for pride, humility. I think that it's helpful just simply to acknowledge at face value that it's okay, at least to me, it's not immediately apparent that we are better than past generations. For instance, I've lived this reality in the context of religious life. When you're young in religious life, you have this kind of spirit of reform. You're like, things are going to get better. But then you find yourself and your peers kind of falling into similar traps that those who have lived before you have fallen into themselves. And you see the kind of assimilative force of, just human sin and the perennial appeal of temptation. And so it's not immediately apparent to me that progress is just going to work itself out inexorably. It's not just going to work itself out automatically. Rather, I am made of the same stuff of those who have gone before me, and the same vices, sins, and temptations threaten to ruin my life as they have ruined the lives of others. So I quote here a philosopher of the last century, who my friend Father Bonaventure Chapman quotes with frequency, Michel Foucault, who says, there are no good times or bad times, there are just perilous times, okay? And I think that that's what we find, that this time is just as perilous as times that have gone before. And just because we haven't yet fallen into the same traps doesn't mean that we won't unless we are vigilant, attentive, careful, right? Unless we are genuinely zealous, but zealous with a critical spirit, which is desirous of addressing our wrongs and our failings so that we can correct them and expose ourselves always and everywhere to the grace of God. So if we are to salvage something from this present evil age, it will be salvaged from the wreck. But the wreck endures, okay? So we are just as much in the wreck as others who have gone before us. Are there certain conditions which have improved? Yeah, but there are also conditions which have gotten worse. So we need to be honest about that. So I think that's just a humble acknowledgement of the fact that we're made of the same stuff and we find ourselves in a similar situation. So we shouldn't just start with auto back pattery, because it's not clear to me that we are better. All right, every good and perfect gift comes down to us from the Father of lights. What do you have that you have not received? If therefore you have received it, why do you boast as if it were your own? Boom. Okay, so let's counter pride with humility. Come, Lord Jesus. Next, for scorn, I think that we try to cultivate a certain generosity of spirit. And when I say generosity of spirit, I mean a generosity of interpretation and then a generosity of engagement, okay? So I think when we scorn something, we tend to distance ourselves from it. So we want nothing to do with it, all right? And we just kind of set it aside as silly, not worth our time, blah, blah, blah. But I think that if we are to grow, as the people of God, as the church militant, then that will mean doing so together, right? In the context of a communion of persons. And I think that if we limit ourselves to just our generation, then we end up blinding ourselves. And I think that that's foolish. So I think that it's good, like as a church, to be engaged cross-generationally, right? In the context of daily mass, for instance, is a great place to meet older people. If you're young and you go to daily mass, older people in church are inevitably going to tell you that you have a vocation to be a religious or to be a priest. Okay, that is probably not the case. It might be the case, but like you're going to fall into, certain characteristic patterns of behavior. That's fine. All right, you just got to get beyond it. But I think that it's worthwhile to cultivate these types of connections. And not, again, in like a patronizing or condescending way, but in a genuine way. And I've seen this done well, especially in certain lay ecclesial movements, like Communion and Liberation, for instance, does things cross-generationally in a way that I find to be very delightful. Because they do it in a way that draws on the strengths and the talents of all those present, right? So they often do it with like food and with music and with festivity, but with a serious engagement with things transcendent, such that all those present have an opportunity to encounter God in a new way and to grow as a result. And I think that this is a way of healing our scorn, right? By a kind of generosity of spirit which engages and so interprets those with whom we live in a more positive light. So again, it doesn't involve mental gymnastics, trying to convince yourself that things are other than they are. I'm not talking about that, right? And I mentioned mental gymnastics with quite a bit of frequency. I'm not into that. But I think that it's for us to kind of bridge these gaps in community so that we, as the people of God, can profit from the communion of persons which we are meant to enjoy at present so that they might grow ultimately unto ages of ages in heaven. So, find a way of doing such. And then last, for dismissiveness, I think that we want to cultivate a certain docility. And docility is a part of the virtue of prudence. Basically, there are two principal ways in which we engage with reality. By discovery and then by instruction. We discover things by experiencing reality, cultivating a memory for our experiences, and then tuning into that. We benefit from instruction by docility. We need to have an interior disposition so that we can receive from others. We can receive their instruction. We can receive from their wisdom. And I think that we have to do this in the context of ecclesial life, because unless we're cognizant of our history, we're like bound to repeat it. So there are these overly facile ecclesiastical stories, like everything was great in the 1968, or the Second Vatican Council happened, and 1968 happened, and everything was awful. But I think that that's just not true. And I think that there are many ways in which we can chasten that narrative or rebuke that narrative and bring it more into line with what is the case. Like church architecture started getting wonky a lot earlier than 1962, 5, 8, okay? But I think it's helpful, for the people who are part of, that generation to hear their story. What do you think Vatican II was addressing? What was it like beforehand? What was it like afterwards? How do you feel like we've done since appropriating that tradition? St. John Paul II, were his efforts successful in so doing? Do you think there's still work to be done? All right. I think those are interesting conversations to have. You might not be motivated to have those conversations, but then there are other conversations which are fruitful, which probably fall more within the bounds of your interest. Because I think otherwise, we're going to repeat these same things, right? So I'm thinking in terms of Tomism, okay? So Tomism has gone through waves. I think that Tomism was a worthwhile ecclesial tradition to continue to propagate through generations of the life of the church, because I think that it helps us to gain access more easily, promptly, joyfully to the truth of the faith, right? To the truth of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so to be transformed by it. But I know that it's had high points and low points, right? That it came back into vogue, after Aeterna Patris in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it kind of came to a certain established position. But within the Second Vatican Council, it really did wane for a couple decades afterwards, and it was only being taught in certain places. And it's only in the last 15 years that Tomism has gained serious traction again in the academy. But I don't want it just to repeat that process, so I need to be conscious of the critiques prior to the Second Vatican Council, so that can be part of my wisdom. That can be part of the way in which I teach the faith, with the help of St. Thomas Aquinas, so that it's not just going to be thrown out, proverbial baby with the bathwater, in another however many years, because I think that the church would suffer as a result. So I want to be sensitive to these critiques. I want to be sensitive to this history, docile, to the wisdom of my elders, so that way I'm not bound to repeat the mistakes of those who have gone before me. So, when it comes to respecting your elders, the main virtue that's concerned is piety, right? Which is a kind of deference to those who have brought us into this world with a certain life and liberty, right? But also, I think we want to address the ways in which we're suspicious of or hypercritical of generations that have gone before us, right? In a certain sense, I think we can be prideful, scornful, dismissive, and I've recommended, seeking to cultivate virtues of humility, generosity of spirit, and then docility, a part of prudence, right? In order to counter that tendency. Do I think that that means that we should all hold hands and sing Kumbaya? No, there are genuine criticisms that ought to be, rendered. There is genuine suspicion that is rightly placed, right? But I think that ultimately we can't fall prey to a certain polarization of spirit lest we just become caricatures and then end up repeating silly tropes. So it's with that it's with that spirit that I share what I share. And that's what I intended, so cheers. This is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, and that way you'll get email updates when other cool things happen on the channel. And if you haven't yet, please do listen to the podcast Godsplaining, Godsplaining, which is a podcast to which I contribute with 4 other friars of my province, with cool conversations about all kinds of ecclesial themes. The occasional guest, the occasional, Lectio Divina episode, the occasional special series. So you'll find all kinds of cool things there. So subscribe to that on your podcast app or on YouTube. And then third and finally, I wrote a book. I talked about docility here. I talk about docility in chapter 4 of the book, Prudence. Choose confidently, live boldly. And it's got all kinds of cool insights for living your life well and choosing with a modicum of confidence. So if you haven't yet, check that out. And I hope you benefit from it. So my prayers are for you. Please pray for me. And I'll catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.